My name is Adrià Yzaguirre. I'm originally from Barcelona, and about 5 years ago I moved to Berlin, where I work as a tattoo artist and sometimes with very selective projects also as an illustrator. I think there's something about my childhood in the north of Spain, and there's a very strong influence in the culture there. I think that made quite an impression on me when I was a kid. We have like a very big national art and history museum in Barcelona, and I would be fascinated by these enormous figures of, Jesus Christ and the baby Jesus that anyway looked as if he was like a shrinked adult, because they were not really able to represent perspective or different ages. So that sort of mistakes and very, very simple way of representing animals, perspective, persons, hands is a little bit what I think eventually dragged me into graphic design, and eventually, some years after would affect my way of drawing, making it every time more simple and more simple and more simple. And by having so strong technical limitations with the tattooing, in the sense of course, everything can be tattooed, but not everything lasts good over time, because you need, to have enough space between lines. You really need to bring down your ego, wanting to put more and more details and more textures into a thing that you know that will last good over time. So that is my main influence, I'd say, from a visual standpoint. And then I think I suck a little bit also from another big one in my region in Spain, Salvador Dalí and the surrealism, and always try to have very simple ideas, but always with a tiny spin of, an impossible match between two objects, or a object out of context, which makes it look odd or weird, or so maybe not so much into this oniric surrealism, exploring the inner deepest corners of the brain and the world of dreams and whatever, but more of this, what did I just see a shell mixed with with a fire extinguisher? That's the sort of mix I try to find. Very simply drawn pieces that are very iconic and you can really see from far away and understand immediately, and then you pass through and you go like, wait, did I just see what I think I saw? Living in Berlin and being surrounded by so many talented artists, you pick one trick from one guy here, you discover an amazing blog of someone that is really, really talented, and I think in the last few years I've picked up different tricks or ways to solve very specific visual problems from many people based in Berlin or coming as guest artists in studios. Initially I came only to check a little bit out the city, see how complicated the language was, how easy it was to survive, how cheap it was to live here. I managed to make a book presentation in Berlin and have like a couple of different art bookstores selling the project, and my plan was to come back to Barcelona and try to push it at the same level as it had been working in Berlin. But I met my girlfriend and I decided to stay, with no plan, no money whatsoever, no language skills, and that was the tough part of it all. But yeah, I think after a couple of years of really struggling with the language and not being able to really work because the language was occupying so much of my time, and I would go 5 hours a day, 5 days a week during almost a year and a half, and then I would have homework and I wouldn't be able to make more than freelance projects every now and then, and it was really, really tough from a money standpoint. It ultimately, everything came together. Suddenly, from not being able to talk German, not being able to get a lot of projects, the German just came at a decent level and things started getting in line. And I'm really glad that I did, and that it was so tough at the beginning, because I think if I wouldn't have had such a hard time, I think I wouldn't have been open to a lot of things that eventually turned out to be things that I really, really love. There's two lines of work that I mainly do, and I think one of them is influenced, I don't know, 90% on the client side. The other one, not so much. So I work in custom pieces that I develop together with the clients, and then on the other side I work on my own designs without a commission, and then I'll eventually offer them as tattoos. And obviously the custom pieces, despite the fact that a lot of people that come to me know more or less the style in which I draw, so you could think that they have a common taste or aesthetic perspective. Every project ends up having a completely different personality depending on how my interaction with each client was. And the crazy thing is that clients not only have influence on the pieces they work in together with me, but also ultimately from each project I'll get out of my comfort zone and be confronted with something that I perhaps don't feel so much like drawing, and I discover it's amazing. That influences also the designs that I work on on my own. There's a market for people wanting this middle ground between illustration or graphic design and tattooing, but the industry per se, which would be tattoo studios, tattoo festivals, material providers, really makes a big effort for things to change as little and slow as possible. Because they had a very sweet time from the beginning of the 80s until the early 2000s. They had the monopole. You would have 6 studios in the same street, and somehow they would all manage to have enough money. They could afford being rude with the customers, not really being into working together with them to develop the design. So either you would walk in and choose a design already existing that they would anyway tattoo over and over and over, or you would bring your design and they would just copy it. So I think for the older generation in the industry, who is mostly who holds the strings right now of the change or progress to be made or not made, I think they really have a hard time adapting to this new and very competitive scenario in which every second talented designer moves into tattooing, and they don't do it in the old school way in which a tattoo artist would choose an apprentice who would need to make an apprenticeship between 3 and 5 years, and that guy could only choose another guy. So that was obviously a very good way of learning, but also a very good way of keeping the business small. And they boomed. Prices are getting also more affordable because there's a lot of creative tattoo artists that would rather get less money and be able to make bigger pieces than with studio rates would be impossible to pay. So I think that we are the generation trying to open a new way of doing things. But what we have a hard time finding is a little bit this support from a bigger infrastructure. I think, like myself, there's a lot of tattoo artists, especially in Berlin. I think in other places it's still very much controlled by big studios and big tattoo material providers and you know who they decide to invite to their festivals and so on. But in Berlin it's quite open. But you find that ultimately 90% of the really talented people or that have a different voice in tattooing have to work from private studios or shared ateliers and so on, because the business doesn't match their way of working. Every project seems to have its own personality, which sounds really douchey, artist. No, every piece of work has its own character, but it's true, and I guess it comes just from the dynamic created between the client, myself, and then ultimately all the bases or all the puzzle pieces in place to create that. And there are some projects I have like a perfect connection with the client. We really understand where each one wants to go, and the project just gets stopped or evolves to something completely different that is not due to not finding a middle ground between the client and myself. It's something completely new and unexpected, far away from what I imagined, really far away from what the client had expected, and just the way it came out. And a lot of times this means having to completely change the initial thought. Someone might come to get a full sleeve tattooed, and we end up being able to compress all the ideas in a small piece. Sometimes it will happen the opposite. Someone will come with a very small, very synthetic graphic design kind of looking symbol that represents whatever story, and we will start talking, and I'll discover that behind that story there's better ways to represent or commemorate that event, and we will end up increasing the size. It's really difficult to explain, especially for someone that has worked his whole life really closed in himself and in his studio, creating without having any external input, and then once everything is ready, would go out to the world to present the work. And that was one of the things that I found the hardest about working, in the gallery circuit, let's say. This needing to close myself and being strong and not being mentally devastated by how isolated I was, and then suddenly after all the work was done, having to go out and being funny, being able to sell my own work, being a little bit the show monkey, and that was really fucking up my brain. So I was, for starters, not used to draw in front of people. I would always need to be really reclusive, like I need my space, and I sometimes would even need to not have people in the same flat or the same room. And how fast everything developed by having so many influences, several each week, of clients that bring a whole new perspective, people that are really amazing storytellers but have no visual conception. They do not think about this story in terms of I want a wolf and I want a bird underneath. They just know what they want to express and they don't know how. The other way around, people that are really good at catching which element this piece require. People that think way more abstract, people that are really into straight lines and graphic design, people that and I think ultimately being confronted, either you want it or not, to all these stories and different perspectives of tattooing and ultimately illustration make you evolve way faster. I'd say there's a part of addiction that is difficult to explain. I guess the only people that can understand the type of addiction that tattooing generates are probably the people that are addicted to get tattooed. It's very difficult to justify why would you do that, why you would go through that, but somehow there's people that click with it and people that don't. And also I have the feeling that I'm part of something big happening. There's not so much going on in a lot of fine arts, and I have for the first time the feeling. So I have the feeling I got a little bit too late in graphic design, when it was already absolutely saturated, and I could only hear amazing stories about the golden era of advertisement during the 80s, and I was obviously too late for that. Same feeling with sculpture, same feeling with illustration, that I was like sort of 5 to 10 years too late for it. And with the tattooing, I have the feeling I jumped into the train, so like 2 years after the pioneer, so I really have the feeling that we're in unknown territory, and that really helps fueling my will of walking together with so many other talented artists. And it will be way more competitive, but way better, because we will keep on motivating each other to improve. It's really exciting to not know at all which direction everything will take.